good afternoon. We're gonna welcome back everybody. All right, so we're gonna get started. In the previous sessions, we have covered several dimensions of the work of the board, including purpose and sustainability, CEO succession, strategy, board dynamics. In this session, we're going to talk about another key aspect of the work of the board, namely the interaction with shareholders. So let me introduce briefly the two speakers. Luca Enriques is a professor of corporate law at the University of Oxford. He has published widely in the fields of company law, corporate governance, and financial regulation. He's a member of the ECGI's board, a fellow academic member of the European Banking Institute, where he co-chairs its FinTech task force, and one of the founding academic editors of the Oxford Business Law blog. Dionysia Katelouzou is professor of corporate law at King's College London. She's a member of the Bar of Athens and a research associate at the Center of Business Research at the University of Cambridge. She leads the ECGI-supported Global Shareholders Stewardship Project, which includes more than 100 academic and non-academic members across 24 countries. So if you ask me to summarize a little bit sort of like the background of these two speakers, I would say that both of them have reflected quite a bit on, let's say, the investor's perspective, and I think that they are in a very good position to sort of like talk about or help, let's say, board members understand what is the perspective of investors when interacting with them. Okay? Like in the previous sessions, we are going to start with a presentation by the two speakers, and then I will take your questions, the questions for the audience. So, Luca, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you. And I will wait for the slide too, but in the meantime, I would like to thank Jordi and Marco for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure to address you on a topic on which I have written a chapter in a book that is forthcoming for Cambridge University Press, exactly on the dialogue between boards and shareholders. This is a book mainly by lawyers. I am a lawyer, so my point of view, you know what it will be. And but at the same time, I will try to give you some facts about who the investors are. And given the audience, it can go under the heading of Know Your Enemy. And so what do we talk about when we talk about shareholders? Of course, there are controlling shareholders when there are controlling shareholders. In many jurisdictions, these are the most important shareholders in most companies. However, large companies and companies for sure in at least some important jurisdictions on both sides of the Atlantic do not have controlling shareholders. They have as their shareholders either retail investors, which we tend to forget because individually they are usually extremely small and therefore can have no meaningful voice. There are strategic investors, other companies that may make investments in either, well, usually not competitors, but possibly even competitors, but companies in contiguous businesses or in companies that are innovating and so on. You can have a sovereign wealth fund, which are a hybrid between the state and an institutional investor. That is, it is the state that acts as an institutional investor. And finally, you have institutional investors, which will be my main focus. In fact, institutional investors, this is a term that comprises a number of different actors. The common theme behind them is that they invest other people's money, but they can have different style, different ownerships, and so on. So some of them are private, Some of them are public, so pension funds, for example, in the US, are often an expression of the local government, the state, and they can directly manage assets, or they can outsource asset management to asset management companies. In the latter case, they are known as asset owners, but they are not. They are owners formally, but still they usually invest other people's money, and more specifically, the money of employees who put aside their savings in pension funds. They can have different legal forms, but the distinctions that really matter are whether they are domestic or foreign, whether they invest in their own countries or elsewhere, whether they are passively or actively managed, that is, whether they choose the investment that they make or they just replicate an index. They can be passive shareholders, that is, do as little as possible in terms of taking part in the life of the company. They can have a more awareness about their role as asset owners or as stewards of that take care about their investments, but they can also be activists and just go for a fight with the management and with boards when they think that something is badly wrong at a company, and they can see an opportunity to make money through forcing change at the company. And another important distinction is, as we will see, is that there are some that are really, really big investors out there. There are 4 of them, as we will see, and there are smaller fish out there. And this makes some kind of a difference. So what happened in the last 40 years or so, and is ever more the case, is that ownership at listed companies has reconcentrated. Nowadays, institutional investors dominate the ownership of publicly listed firms, and they are actually globally the largest category of shareholders. They own more than 30 trillion euro of assets, and that's 3 times government holdings. We are talking about listed companies, of course, and 6 times the controlling shareholders holding, according to OECD data. Their presence is really relevant also in continental Europe, where ownership is more concentrated than elsewhere. The numbers are around 30% on average of listed companies in continental Europe is held by institutional investors. And of course, there's usually a 50% that is in the hands of controlling shareholders or something around that figure. What also happened in these, let's say, 20, 25 years is a strong concentration within the asset management industry, driven mainly by the diffusion of passive investment strategies, because to be a passive investor means to have a scale economy, so the larger you are, the more money you make, basically, and there's a strong incentive to concentrate. And so there are now 3 giant asset managers that are dominating the passive fund ETF market, and these are State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock, and they held on average in the end of 2021, and that figure therefore is now higher, 18.7% of the largest 500 companies in the US, and similar amounts, as we will see, slightly lower, but similar amounts in Europe. Actually, the big 3 is the wrong. This is my own equation for the day, and it's also a simple one. But so there's not just the big three, because there's also Fidelity, which is as big as the other three in terms of assets under management. It's also active in the passive management sector. But to be clear, there are four big giant asset managers out there that we should have in mind when we talk about them. So data on institutional ownership are very commonly known for the US. There are many studies that give those numbers. With Giovanni Strampelli, with whom I wrote the introduction to this volume, we gathered some data on Europe, and we decided to see who owns, what the shareholdings are of the 25 largest institutional investors in the EU companies included in the indexes, in the index for the largest European listed firms and the 15 largest UK companies in the UK. So we have 65 companies in the sample, and we want to see what their stakes are in these companies. And as you can see, they own a significant amount in these companies. This is just the 20. This is just considered the top 25. So these figures give you an idea of what the largest of them own in these companies, and you can see that the percentage for the big three is lower than the one I gave you for the US, but still considerable, 8.31%. Fidelity doesn't change the pictures that much, and it's a higher percentage in the UK, yeah, and that's an interesting fact as well. So, what is the largest largest shareholders in these top 65 companies around Europe? As you can see, asset managers are the largest shareholders in more than half of the cases, much more frequent for the largest companies than controlling shareholders. And so ownership is widely held in Europe as well when it comes to the largest companies. I will now say a few words about asset managers' ownership and nationality, because I think it's relevant. So, in theory at least, you would expect institutional investors who are part of a diversified financial group or a financial conglomerate to behave differently than independent asset managers, because they will be part of a larger groups which will provide services to issuers, to listed companies, and therefore there will be a conflict of interest which may lead them to be more passive than an independent asset manager. And so they will have weaker incentives to engage. And as you can see from these figures, this is about the 16 largest asset managers in the US and the 16 largest asset managers in Europe. In Europe, we have a greater prevalence of asset managers that belong to financial conglomerates. So the picture would make us think that Europeans would be less active than their US counterparts. But actually, that is not the case, especially when it comes to ESG topics. Here, there is a significant divide between Europe and the US, and European asset managers tend to be more active in these areas, even when they are part of larger groups, banking groups or insurance group. Whereas in the US, the independent players like the giant three that I mentioned before, or actually the big four, are quite, well, recalcitrant, let's say, to engage with ESG issues. They tend to side with management more. One word about common ownership of common owners. So you know that the giant three own shares in all listed companies, and therefore they all own shares in the companies in the same industry, and there is a very vibrant debate on whether this has anti-competitive effects. No one, as far as I'm aware, has focused on the fact that even the big three are common owners of themselves. That is, BlackRock, for example, owns shares in State Street, but also in itself. And Vanguard is very special because basically when you buy a share in a Vanguard mutual fund, you also buy shares in Vanguard, the asset management company. So it's basically a company controlled by management, and owners are completely uninterested in how Vanguard, the company itself, is run. But Vanguard, in turn, invests in BlackRock and State Street. What the implications are of that, I leave it to you, but it's an interesting fact. And so in terms of the shareholdings by type of asset manager ownership, you can see that this is about Europe again. There is mainly because of the big four, independent asset managers have and publicly owned asset managers, which comprise the big four. They have a stronger presence than bank-owned and insurance-owned companies, asset managers in European large listed firms. And we looked into who owns what in terms of nationality, and the short story is that US companies, US asset managers own European listed firms disproportionately more than European asset managers. So shareholders in European firms, institutional shareholders, are mainly, or at least are more represented by US institutional investors than European institutional investors, like 3 to 1, basically. So we think that this is an important fact. So again, US asset managers dominate in terms of ownership compared to European funds. Why is that? Well, first of all, because nationality can affect institutional investors' approach to engagement in various ways. We have seen a moment ago that European asset managers tend to be more active on ESG matters. This is another way of seeing this phenomenon. It's taken from a Share Action report on votes on ESG matters, and it shows you that the green bubbles are the European asset managers. They tend to vote in favor of ESG resolutions wherever, globally, much more than the red ones that are the European investors. But in addition to that, there is at least one can make the intuition that investors can be expected to engage more with home portfolio companies than with foreign ones. It's harder to become active abroad because you need to get to know the local culture, the local corporate governance practices, and that may be costly. That you have to have a certain size to do that, but you may also be more prone to political backlash if, as a foreigner, you try and go to tell another country's management how they should run their companies based on your own values and views about the world. And also, if it is true, as Michael Barbusa and co-authors have argued, that asset managers care about ESG because they want to persuade millennial and Gen Z investors to choose them as investors asset managers who care about the future of the planet, etc., then it is likelier that they will want to show their credentials as credible ESG-focused investors with companies that are domestic, so that their clients will see them acting more vividly. And then with the foreign institutions acting abroad on foreign companies, there is a higher risk of political backlash. As I said, who are you from some other countries to tell me whether I should care more about employees, the environment, and so on. And so 9 out of 10 of the asset managers that were banned from providing services to the Texas state because of their attitudes towards oil were European, perhaps not coincidentally. And of course, geopolitical tensions may make this kind of dynamics even worse. And finally, but I think importantly, if large institutional investors are foreign, they will be weaker at lobbying the politicians when it comes to making policy that is relevant to corporate governance, so namely corporate law. And so anywhere else than in the US, you can expect insiders to be stronger as an interest group in shaping corporate laws, because clearly it's much easier for politicians to cater to the interests of local strong interest groups rather than someone out there in New York or wherever. A few words on stewardship. So what is stewardship? Of course, Dionysia will focus more on this topic, but it's important. And so I will say just a few things. So stewardship can be defined as responsible ownership and accountability for asset managers acting both as shareholders of investee companies and the agents of their own beneficiaries. The understanding is that with great power comes great responsibility, of course, and therefore, if you have a huge holdings in listed firms, you can't just neglect the rights that you have in those companies. You can't. So voting basically is an asset, as the Department of Labor of the U.S. government once said. And you have to do something with it. You have to use it responsibly. But there is an inescapable truth, which is that if I manage other people's money, when I vote my shares, I don't have myself a direct interest in the shares that I am voting. And this phenomenon in other contexts is known as empty voting. And the only curb on misuse or negligent use of this power is fiduciary duties, which are seldom, if ever, enforced, and reputation. They are also made stronger by stewardship statements, which are voting and engagement policies that asset managers usually prepare, draft, and then make public as a way of committing to be responsible owners. And the Shareholder Rights Directive in Europe also nudges investors to engage with companies. But it all rests, even stewardship calls, ultimately rest on reputation. So the point is that it's not important whether these people vote. They should vote if they gather all the relevant information and exercise voting rights, knowing what they are doing. And the empty voters are unlikely to have a strong incentive to become informed and to vote in the interest of their clients and in the interest of portfolio companies. And yet, as I said, the law and the politics have since long pushed managers in the direction of voting, quote unquote, anyway, which is why many of them, especially smaller ones, will delegate proxy advisors to tell them how to vote. And clearly, proxy advisors have no incentives either, again, other than developing their own business to give the right advice. So this begs the question of whether we could accept a legal system or a policy that is actually neutral vis-a-vis investor choices on whether to vote, and so therefore more accepting of the idea that these institutional investors may sometimes be perfectly legitimated to not vote because they may not have enough information. And in fact, Dorothy Lund, an ECGI research associate, wrote a provocative article arguing that passively managed funds shares should not be voted. There should be no vote coming from passive managers because they cannot be expected to be informed. The questions are whether they can have the right incentives. Yes, and there is this idea that these giant investors are universal owners. They own the entire economy. They could act as systematic stewards. That is, they could be the ones who really take care about climate change and social inequality and so on, because if that has a negative, if these are things that can have a negative impact on the economy, they stand to lose qua asset managers if things go wrong. But again, whether they do have the incentives to do that and whether they have the knowledge to understand how they should vote in order to avoid the consequences of climate change or pollution and so on is a legitimate question. And finally, we should ask whether we can really, we really want these investors to have this role in society. So finally, a couple of words on the legal framework on the dialogue between boards and shareholders. I will skip that slide and just say that there is a big difference between the US and Europe when it comes to shareholder rights, which is that in Europe, shareholder meetings tend to be more powerful than in the US because they decide on more matters than a typical US shareholder meeting. So as a group, investors, and therefore institutional investors, are more powerful in theory or based on what the law allows them to do in Europe than in the US, but at the same time, individual rights, shareholder rights that are given by the law to small shareholders are less effective in Europe than in the US. And this is the reason why the phenomenon of shareholder proposal, which we started with this morning, is much more common in the US than in Europe. In the US, you have to invest a few $1,000s to make a shareholder proposal, to have it inserted in the proxy card of the company. In Europe, you have to hold a different amount depending on the member state, but it's usually around 2%, 3 to 2.5% of the shares. So it's much less easy for stakeholders to dress up as shareholders to propose changes at individual companies. And another point where the law becomes relevant is in the fact that it can put a serious obstacle to dialogue between boards and shareholders, because selective disclosures of material information are discouraged by the law. Actually, they are illegal other than with some specific arrangements that have to be put in place every time with the individual shareholders. But most importantly, in Europe, a shareholder who gets to be given inadvertently or intentionally inside information cannot trade, and which is something that institutional investors will not want because they want to be free to liquidate shares. Whereas in the US, there is no violation of insider trading laws by an institutional investor who gets privileged inside information. And finally, the limits that European rules impose on information sharing among investors from an investor to another investors are much stricter than in the US. So wrapping up, I started saying that it's about knowing your enemy. That was a joke, of course, but if boards want to do well in an environment of institutional shareholders, they better engage with them, and they should do so in a non-discriminatory way, and try to maintain a line of communication with the shareholders and the proxy advisors as well. And they, citing back to Amir Licht, the boards should also learn to think about what the mainly US investors may expect, while never forgetting that these are agents of their beneficiaries, the workers, the savers, and that they may be as conflicted as managers vis-à-vis the company itself. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Luca. First of all, I would like to say a big thank you to Jordi and Marco for inviting me here today. For those who don't know me, I'm a corporate lawyer. I have been working in the area of investor stewardship for about 10 years now, or even a little bit longer. So what I want to ask from you is that for the next 20 minutes, you put yourselves in the shoes of institutional investors. And because that's what I will try to do with you today. And thank you, Luca, for setting the scene perfectly for me, because I don't have to explain the basics about institutional investors and how they engage with the board. So I suppose the first question to ask is why we do even care about investor stewardship. Why we do care about institutional investors. The obvious answer, and Luca already presented some interesting statistics, is because institutional investors own, on average, the majority of publicly listed companies, not only in the UK, but also in the US and across Europe. Just to give you some examples, the UK asset management industry alone oversees 11 trillion of assets. If you look at the market capitalization in the UK, you will see that investors own about 62% of the UK market. And if you look at the EU as a whole, it is about 38%. So still, it's quite a significant amount. And also, I think it's quite important to say here that there has been an increase over the last 20 years, right? Even in countries with concentrated ownership like Italy or Spain, for instance, or France. Now, this is not the only reason why we care about institutional investors. Actually, the most important reason why we care about them and why we care about how they engage with the board is because they invest on behalf of others. And Luca already pointed that. So when you're talking about engagement between institutional investors and board members or managers, you need to consider that you engage with somebody who acts on behalf of others. And what I'm looking currently is who those others are, and whether those others are the same others that the board of directors are acting for. So in other words, what is the purpose of stewardship? What is the purpose of asset management? And whether this purpose aligns with the purpose of companies and the purpose of corporations. So where we find those two purposes, I think that's the heart of investor stewardship currently. Investor communities, scholars, policymakers are completely divided about the role of institutional investors. There are, views that favor shareholder engagement. There are other that they don't really. They focus a lot on short-termism, on conflicts of interest. So you can see both, and you can actually see that debate in the UK right now, and the proposed changes in the UK listing rules, for instance. What is also quite important is that in another work that we have done before, actually it is a book, the Global Shareholder Stewardship book, we looked at about 22 different stewardship codes around the world, and we focused, for those you don't know, a stewardship code is like the equivalent to the corporate governance code. So it's a non-binding set of principles. The first code was the UK code that was developed in 2010, and then it was revised in 2012. And since then, there are more than 22 codes around the world. Many of those codes have been revised. In Spain, for instance, the first code was introduced last year in February, and is a non-binding set of 7 principles, for instance. So in the book, as you may notice, the title is Shareholder Stewardship, Global Shareholder Stewardship. And the reason was that back then, when we were writing the book, we were looking at stewardship from the perspective of shareholders. So we were thinking that institutional investors only engage as shareholders. I think in your presentation, Luca, but also in mine, we tend to use the term investor stewardship nowadays more often rather than shareholder stewardship. And the reason for that is because institutional investors engage not only as shareholders, they also engage as bondholders, for instance, or they also engage in private markets, in private equity, in infrastructure. So they engage as different types of investors, not only as shareholders. And that's also quite an important consideration when we are talking about the role of institutional investors in corporate governance. So it goes beyond shareholders and shareholder rights. Now, even though we are talking a lot about stewardship, what we are currently lacking is a kind of an analytical framework that explains what we mean by a steward. If you ask institutional investors or board members or policymakers what they mean, you will see that they mean different things. There are some that they talk about engagement and voting. So when they use the term stewardship, they mean responsible engagement, responsible dialogue, responsible voting. There are others that they are talking more about how you manage your portfolio, how you integrate ESG. So they take a more a broader perspective, an ESG-oriented perspective. And also what we see from interviewing consumers, we see that even consumers themselves, sometimes they don't really get what we mean by steward. They don't really, they cannot really align the stewardship notion with the role of a shareholder. And I think this goes back to the previous panel that talk about the agency theory and the stewardship theory, and how the stewardship theory is understood in corporate governance. So what I'm trying to do in this paper is to go back to the origins of stewardship and try to create a kind of an analytical framework. Believe it or not, etymologically, the first time we see stewardship is back in the Middle Ages, and it comes from the word stig and weird, and this means a housekeeper or a house guardian. Now, for those familiar with the corporate governance literature, I'm sure you will be familiar with the notion of managers as stewards. And this is the most common way of using steward as a word in corporate governance studies. So mostly we understand managers as stewards in the sense, and this goes back to what it was discussed in the previous panel, in the sense of, trust and a kind of social responsibility. But what is interesting to note is that in literature and also in practice, you don't really think of shareholders as stewards, at least not, before the introduction of the code, of the UK stewardship code in 2010, right? Before that, mostly we were talking, when we were thinking about shareholders, we were mostly thinking about principals. And the agency, I'm sure we're all familiar with this analogy of the shareholders as those who monitor on behalf, those who monitor the managers, right? So the kind of principals and the managers as the agents. So this is the kind of the popular narrative in corporate governance. And in this narrative, and I think, Luca, you already mentioned that, what we sometimes forget is that when you're talking about investors, the investors are not just the monitors. They're not just the principals, but they are agents themselves, because they act on behalf of their own clients and their own beneficiaries. And this has been described as the double set of agency relationships. So to put it simply, an asset manager is expected to act as a monitor of the managers, right? But at the same time is also an agent acting on behalf of his own clients and beneficiaries. Now, what this theory lacks is the focus on responsibilities. So the agency theory takes the perspective, takes a kind, focuses a lot on powers. Who has the power to monitor? But it doesn't really look at the responsibilities. And this is what the stewardship framework tries to fit in. So we take inspiration from the stewardship theory of management, and we try to apply that in the context of shareholders. So here you can see a very simplistic, I would say, framework of what we mean when we say that an investor is a steward. So to put it simply, a steward exercises power, but importantly, it exercises that power on behalf of others and for others. Now, let's take the example of an asset manager, right? An asset manager who is a shareholder in a company. When we talk about power, I suppose we all understand that this goes back to company law, right, and shareholder rights. So depending on the country, depending on your ownership stake, you have certain powers. It can be voting power, but it can also be the power to call a meeting, for instance, or the power to remove a director or to appoint a director. Now, this is something that all the shareholders have, right? I mean, all the shareholders have rights. The difference when it comes to institutional investors is that they exercise that power on behalf of others who are the clients or beneficiaries, depending on the type of the investor. And at the same time, there is the expectation, and this is quite important, I think, and this is not always understood correctly, that they do so for others, and those others are not necessarily the same on behalf of whom they act. I'm going to make that more specific by giving you an example. But if you're familiar, for instance, with, I don't know who of you have read Fukuyama's Political Order, but there is an analogy here with political orders. So in political economy, you have the state who is constrained by the rule of law and also accountable government. So there is a kind of analogy between, rule of law and acting on behalf of others and accountability and for others. So let me make this a little bit more specific using the example of shareholder stewardship. So the example where you have an investor who is a shareholder. So in that case, the exercise of power depends on company law. I think that's quite clear, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. Now, the second element of stewardship, acting on behalf of others, this depends a lot on investment management regulation. This has nothing to do with company law or corporate law, but those others are being protected by case law in the UK. So for instance, if you're a pension fund in the UK, those others that the trustees are acting upon, those are protected by case law. They can be protected by contract or by investment management regulation. So for instance, if you are an asset owner, let's take the example of a pension fund in the UK. You are acting on behalf of your own beneficiaries, and the way you're acting, the prescriptions, those prescriptions are being defined by law, right, by case law and also by pension fund law. Now, so this is the duties you have. I think, Luca, you mentioned the role of fiduciary duties, fiduciary and non-fiduciary duties, but these are not company law, right? So these duties are coming from investment management regulation. Now, at the same time, this is a necessary element, the fact that you are acting on behalf of others, but there is also this additional element that stewardship theory of management describe as psychological ownership or active ownership. I'm not sure if you have ever heard of those terms. So those are coming from management theory, the stewardship theory of management. And by psychological ownership, they mean the kind of other-serving function. So you take your ownership in a way that is not within the economic parameters only. But is a kind of other-serving rather than self-serving role. Now, the key question, of course, here is, all right, who are the others? Who are those others about, whom we are talking about? And this figure here tries to show you the different others, or the different stakeholders, if we want to use a different term. So let me try to make it as simple as possible. Let's take the example of an asset owner, right? So focus on the asset owner. And let's take the example of an asset owner with delegated management. So you have an asset owner who delegates stewardship to an asset manager, okay? So in that case, what you have in practice, you have different stewardship relationships. You have one relationship between the asset owner and the clients of that asset owner. This is what I call client stewardship. And this is provided by law, right? So those clients, those beneficiaries are protected by law, not company law, but by pension fund law, for instance, in the case of a pension fund. And if you go a step further to the flow funds, so to the asset managers, the asset manager who exercises stewardship on behalf of the asset owner effectively is the steward for those clients and beneficiaries, right? So effectively you have, I don't know why the laser is not working, so I can't really point to the figure, but what I'm trying to say is that when you go to the asset manager, that asset manager legally is only a steward for the asset owner. So when you have an asset manager that engages with you, legally that asset manager only acts on behalf of his own clients, right? So those clients are the asset owners in that case, in the example I'm giving you. The asset manager is not acting on behalf of the end investors. because there is no contractual relationship between the end investors and the asset manager. The only relationship, contractual relationship, is between, on the one hand, the asset owner and the asset manager, and the asset owner and the end investor. So what does this mean in practice, and what is the gap here? The gap here is that from a legal point of view, there is no connection between the asset manager and the end investors, and moreover, there is no connection between the asset managers and the broader society or the broader economy, right? So what I call in my book, enlightened stewardship. So let me check the time. I do have a couple of minutes. Feel free to ask questions, right, about this diagram, because it's a bit complicated to realize how those different relationships work. But the main point is that when you think about stewardship, stewardship takes place at different levels at the same time, and there are different stakeholders that they have, possibly conflicted interests as well. And this goes back to the discussions of some of the other panels about conflicted interests. Also, I suppose the key question again is that who are those others, right? So who are those others on behalf of an asset manager or a steward is acting for? And I think I already explained that if you take the law, from a regulatory perspective, those others are the clients and beneficiaries. These are the only ones that are being, protected from a hard law perspective. Now, and I think I gave before the example of the asset managers, right? So the asset manager responsibility is towards the immediate contracting party, so the asset owner, for instance. But there is no hard law binding responsibility to the end investor, so to the client of the asset owner. Now, having said that, is this the end of the, is this the end of the story? Not really. There have been a lot of policy discussions about expanding the others. There have been discussions about how you can expand the responsibilities of institutional investors so they do take into account different types of others. One example, one way of filling the gaps is through stewardship codes. So in a way, the stewardship codes, starting with the UK stewardship code back in 2010, 2012, but also after the global movement in stewardship, what they try to do is to create non-binding standards, non-binding principles that can protect those others that are not really captured through law. So to make this a little bit more specific for you, I'm going to take the example of the UK code, the 2021, so the revised version of the UK code. One of the principles of the code, actually two principles of the code, Principles 4 and Principle 7, they focus a lot on ESG, and this was one of the topics of the earlier panels. They focus a lot on how stewards, how asset managers and asset owners as stewards should take into account financial material, social issues or environmental issues, and broader interests, rather than simply the financial interest, the short-term financial interest. So in doing so, they expand those others, right? So in doing so, the code asks from asset managers and asset owners to take into account others that are not really protected through contractual relationships. And this is the gap-filling role of stewardship codes, or at least some of the stewardship codes. Of course, here we can talk for ages about the limitations of this model. one weakness is that it's a non-binding model, right? So that's soft law, it's non-binding. Another important limitation is that can an investor steward serve others who are not financial material? How about non-financial material ESG issues, for instance? Is this allowed? Or another problem is which others are to be prioritized when there are conflicts of interest? And for those because I know that most of you are coming from the board perspective, I think there are some interesting analogies here with Section 172, for instance, of the UK Companies Act 2006, right? So when you have, when you're serving different others, how you prioritize between those others. To make it more specific, do you always prioritize your clients and beneficiaries? Or you can prioritize, for instance, the environment or social issues when they're financial material. And how about non-financial materiality? So for all these questions, there are no clear answers in the code, in the UK Code 2020. And actually, what is even more frustrating is that most of the codes outside the UK, they don't even take into account those others. Most of the codes outside the UK, they mostly look at stewardship as responsible engagement, responsible voting. They don't really look at at all the nuances and the interplays that take place at the investment chain. And what are the implications of engagement or the implications of responsible management for all these different players. Just to summarize, I suppose, and then I'm open to questions and thoughts. What this project tries to do, and that's part of a much broader book I'm currently finalizing on stewardship, is to try to create a framework to make sense of the term stewardship. Because stewardship is quite a new term and is not really used to associate shareholders. It's also quite useful in understanding the different actors. And I think, Luca, you already mentioned, for instance, passive investors or activist investors. And I think I disagree with your terminology in the sense that I think that a passive investor can be a steward as well, especially at the portfolio level, and you mentioned systematic stewardship. And also an activist investor can be a steward as well. So we shouldn't associate, because what I see from interviews and from talking with investors is that board members always associate activist investors with the bad guys, the bad short-term guys. That's not, I'm not saying that they are not, these guys as well, but I'm saying that an activist investor can be steward as well, especially at the firm-specific level. So that's also quite an important message. Of course, there are many challenges that we still, for which we still don't have answers. For instance, how you protect others or how you protect stakeholders that are not really clearly protected under binding law, under hard law, how you bring them into stewardship. And can you realistically ask from investors, for instance, to save the planet? Can they save the planet? Can they minimize all the externalities? Because for years, we never really, we never really, I suppose that 10 years ago, you wouldn't expect from an institutional investor to minimize externalities, because these were perceived as externalities. Currently, we are expecting from investors to minimize or at least to address externalities. So how realistic is that, and what are the limits there and what are the challenges there? Especially when those others, especially when the interests of your clients and beneficiaries do not align with the interests of the society. So what is the solution when you have conflicts of interest? I think I'm probably going to stop here because I can see the time, and I think it's really important to have the chance to interact a little bit more on those different concepts of stewardship. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Luca and Dionysia, for these insights. So the title of this conference is Towards a New Model of Boards of Directors, right? So you have described certain trends in institutional ownership, right? So I guess, one question would be, are we observing also with, along with this sort of evolution in ownership, right? So are we also observing an evolution in the way boards interact with shareholders? And this is related to one of the questions that the person wanted to know more about how asset managers engage with firms. So Luca, maybe you might want to get started, and then we will pick up Dionysia's thoughts.
Okay, so first of all, this is an area which is very difficult to research on. So Marco Becht has done excellent work trying to understand what happens behind the scenes, which is where most of the action takes place. And therefore, it's not easy to know what forms this dialogue takes. But what I can say is that the evidence is that there has been an evolution because traditionally it was management who would keep the relationships with investors, but on the demand of institutional investors themselves, it's nowadays more common for board members to be involved in this dialogue, usually at the request of institutional investors themselves. So they may want to hear the views also of independent directors, not just management. And this is quite intuitive because if you only speak with the CEO, you cannot tell how the CEO is viewed by the board itself, whether there are critical voices, whether there are doubts on the direction of the company, which is something that you can get by having a dialogue also with other board members, for example, the lead independent directors. And of course, this is the source of tensions within board between management and independent directors. The management doesn't want independent board members to have to be given to have a dialogue with investors without at least the presence of the investor relation manager, and if not the CEO themselves. So this is one evolution that you can observe. In general, there is evidence that there is greater engagement on the part of investors, both in the US and in Europe. Our book has a chapter by Tonello Gatti and Strampelli, who write about engagement in the US, which has an interesting number, which is that they have interviews with general counsel and directors, etc. What they get is that 60% of the engagement episodes that are reported by interviewees are from hedge funds. So it's activist investors that are the most active in opening a dialogue with investors, but the other 40% are stewards or non-activist investors.
This might be interesting for all the board members here in the room, that to know that there's a higher demand for board members to be engaged in these interactions, right? So Dionysia.
No. I completely agree. And what we say in the UK also is that it really depends on the topic as well. So, for instance, if the topic is remuneration, it's quite common that you engage with the chair of the remuneration committee, and the same if you have like a sustainability committee. So it really depends also on the topic, but we see that as well a lot in the UK. And I think another evolution, because there is an evolution, another evolution is that most of the engagement, as Luca said, takes place outside of the meeting. So outside of the general meetings, and I would say outside of the strict prescriptions of law. right? So it's more like behind the scenes dialogue, private dialogue between the members before a crisis, before the crisis.
Shareholder meetings are dying, basically,
Yes.
a slow death, but they are dying.
So we have been talking quite a bit here about that there is a wide heterogeneity across investors, and that might be a little bit challenging to work with, right? When it comes to interacting with these investors, like understanding their objectives, what is the perception of this stewardship concept, right? That we have been talking about. I mean, these investors might have different preferences, towards risk, different investment horizons, right? And this sort of relates, to several questions here that I'm going to try to group. There are some concerns, and these concerns are showing up in these questions on certain, let's say, types of investors, right? Passive investors, they might not have strong enough incentives, to engage with companies. The big three, there's the concern that they might have too much power. There's also comments about Chinese investors, the investment behavior of UK pension funds recently. So what would be, your maybe recommendation or your thoughts or your insights for, the board members here when it comes to deal with this heterogeneity in this sort of like interaction with investors, right? Interactions that don't necessarily have to be direct interactions. It could be interactions through other channels, right? Public disclosure, annual meetings, conference calls. What would be your thoughts on this? Do you want to start, Dionysia?
Yes, of course. I suppose my starting point would be you need to know your shareholders. You need to know who your shareholders are. And I don't mean just the name of the shareholder, the percentage they have, but you really need to know what they stand for, what they represent for, right? So I think that would be my starting point. Now, in terms of the different types of shareholders, we can discuss this for ages, right? One parameter is domestic versus foreign investors. I think, Luca, you already mentioned that. Then another important parameter is passive versus active. However, what I want to emphasize here is that there is this perception that passive investors do not engage at all. That's a misconception in my view. I mean, they do engage, but they engage differently. So they are mostly interested in kind of systemic or broad range topics, right? So for instance, if one of the issues in your board agenda has to do with, with climate change or net zero, I think you should expect that you're going to engage with passive investors if there are passive investors among your big, your large owners. That's one thing. The next thing I want to mention is that what we see in the UK is that there is a kind of prioritization in the way that investors engage. So even those investors that are not activists, right? So they are not the standard activist investors. They do engage if there is, let's say, a critical issue with a company, or they engage with a specific company to set an example for other companies. So you may be in the rare scenario where the investor engages with you because they want to set up an example with your company, using your company as an example for other companies. So again, the reason I'm saying that is sometimes you may be in a position where you engage in situations where you wouldn't expect that you would engage, if this makes sense. And then, of course, you have always the hedge fund activist, the activist hedge funds or other different types of activist investors with whom you engage, but on different issues, I think. So with activist hedge funds, it's mostly about performance or strategy or, a governance issue. So it has to do more with the value. But also what I see is that there are also activist investors who are not hedge funds, but they're not activists all the time. So you can be an active or an activist. Sometimes you're an active, sometimes you're an activist one. So it really depends on the prioritization you have. And don't forget also that you may have an investor who have both passive and active funds, right? So that's also quite an important consideration.
Yeah, so This is a great question, and I think it was asked also very similarly in the previous panel. Anna-Louise gave a good answer, I think, to the similar question, and her answer was that it's about process, and you have to have a process in place to deal with this kind of situation, a policy basically, or anyhow internal rules on how to deal with this. But ultimately, however, we are talking about the core corporate governance / corporate law question, which is to whom the fiduciary duties are owed, what should the board do in terms of purpose, and so there is a legal and a practical answer to your question. So the legal answer is that in any situation, the board's only polar star should be the interest of the company as defined by law or by the charter, and therefore the board members should listen to everyone's voices and then take whatever is relevant that they may have learned from the participants in the dialogue, and then make the decision that they believe to be in the best interest of the company, whatever that is, within the framework of the company's strategy and the environment and so on. The practical question answer to the question is that boards actually act as mediators between conflicting interests, and so it's the same answer, because still they have to act in the interest of the company, but in practical terms they will often try to find the solution to a given problem, or the pathway that leads to satisfying most of the stakeholders and in a way that is consistent with the law.
Very good. So we have time for only one more question. I mean, I really need, because we are very close to the end of the session, I really need a quick answer, just short insight for the audience here. I'm going to be a little bit more magnanimous than Govert. Govert gave the speakers 15 seconds. I'm going to give you half a minute to address this. But I guess the question is also an easy one. Okay, so I mean, we've been talking about heterogeneity across investors, but another sort of like maybe complication, or I don't know if the complication is the right word. Maybe it's an opportunity, right? So it's basically the role of sustainability here, right? So I mean, it's something that has an increasing interest, but sometimes it might be the case that there is a trade-off between sustainability performance and maybe short-term financial performance. This is something that has come out also in the prior panels, right? So any sort of like quick insight or some idea that could be useful for the board of directors present here, to have in mind when dealing with this sort of challenge when in their interactions with investors. Do you want to start, Luca?
Yeah, it's easy, an easy question. I would say that short-term performance is an issue when the life of the company is at stake. As Amir told us, that's the legal standard in common law jurisdiction. So if you're about to die, then you shouldn't worry about external sustainability. You want to survive, unless that's the best thing to do for the planet and everyone else, but corporate suicide is not yet something. And whenever that is not the case, there is no such thing as short-term horizon, because a company is meant to last, and therefore you shouldn't yield to short-termist requests from investors.
Very good. Dionysia?
Yeah, it's not an easy one. I suppose one thing to bear in mind here is the demand side and the supply side of sustainability. So if we consider that the board or the company is going to supply it, then the question is the demand coming from the investors? And this goes back to the previous question about what kind of sustainability or what kind of objectives its investor is bringing to the board. And this goes back to the point I was trying to make about the others that the investors are acting for, right? So if you take the example of, let's say, an ESG fund, I think the answer is easy. Because an ESG fund, by definition, serving ESG objectives, right? So then when an ESG fund brings that to the board, you know that you have a clear agenda. But when you have a different type of fund where ESG is not really part of what the clients or beneficiaries want, I think this is where the dynamics or the nuances are even much more complex from both the perspective of the board, but also the perspective of the shareholders and the investors.
Very good. So unfortunately, time is up, and we need to finish. Just two very quick highlights, maybe from all this, the content of this discussion. The first one, in my mind, would be that as a board member, it is important to understand who your investors are. I think that we agree on this. And the second one would be that I think it is important to reflect on what stewardship means, right? Especially in a world where we have wide heterogeneity across investors, and also we have an increasing interest in stakeholder, not just shareholder interests. So with this, thank you very much, Luca and Dionysia, for your insights, and thank you everyone for your attention and questions.